In the AWS Developers Podcast today, we're talking about the AWS documentation. There is a lot to say about it, where it is now, where we are going with the documentation, how we listen to your feedback. You will hear all that in a moment. Good morning. It's Friday morning. Friday morning in all good podcast applications, you can find a new episode of the AWS Developers Podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, Deezer, even on YouTube. Even if the video is not published, at least you can listen to us on YouTube. Today, I have the privilege to host Greg Wilson, your director at AWS, in charge of the documentation, the SDK, and the command line. It's a huge perimeter, but today we are going to narrow it down to documentation, which is still a huge perimeter. AWS is known for having a lot of documentation. Usually the feedback I hear from our customers is everything is there. It's great. It's difficult to find, but we find it. Everything is there. And you embark with your team on a huge project to revamp, to restructure, to make it easier to read. And you start last year. What was the starting point? What triggers this project?
That's a great question. When I joined AWS to take on this role, I honestly thought that fixing docs, so to speak, was going to be an easy job. I know what good docs look like. Most of my career, I was a software engineer, and how hard can it be? And but what I quickly learned is that the scale of AWS is documentation that has accumulated for all of the various services and features, and the pace at which new documentation is being created, because every few days something launches, and everything that launches needs documentation for it. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to use.
Invisible, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you hit on a really good point. When I first got here, I did a lot of listening and talked to a lot of friends of mine that are developers and avid users of AWS. And one of the things I heard repeatedly is that once I find the documentation, it's actually pretty good. With a few challenges, and we'll get to that in a bit. But so discoverability or findability was a real challenge, and so that's something we wanted to tackle, which means we needed to sort of reorganize the documentation and try to anticipate how people look for it and what it is they're needing. And then once they find the documentation they're looking for, where would they want to go next? Like, what is the next topic they need to learn about? If you think about your experience when you go to like a big box store, I'm not going to mention any brand names because I don't know who's a customer of AWS and who's not. But imagine a very large hardware store and that serves the needs of electrical or plumbing or installing a new toilet, whatever, right? So, and this analogy actually fits really well, and I think it speaks to why we decided to tackle the things we tackled. When you go to a hardware store, there are days that you go and you need a specific thing. You need to replace a breaker that won't stay reset in your house. And your idea of a perfect trip to that store is you find it quickly, you get it, and you get the heck out. And you don't want to browse. You're not there to shop. You just, it's not what's on your mind. You just want your breaker and you want to get out. But, a couple of days later, you might be in a completely different mode. And you go to that same store because you're shopping for countertops. And you don't know anything about countertops. And you're overwhelmed with the choices. And I speak from experience. I did this. This is why I use this as a real example. Yeah, exactly. But I think it's actually, and I'll give you the parallel in AWS in a bit. But if you go in looking for countertops, we quickly discovered there's granite and there's quartz, there's concrete. I didn't know that was a thing. It's super cool. There's butcher block. There's all these different options. And I was just like, there's too many choices. I feel overwhelmed. I don't know what I need. And I'm not informed enough to make a good decision because I don't know the pros and cons of each. And more importantly, I don't know what each is optimized for. And so I need to be able to make a decision. And so in that case, I I don't necessarily want someone to come up to me and interview me and say, okay, at the end of the interview, here's what you need. I want someone to come up and tell me um, uh, the pros and cons of each. What are the things I should consider? Like, don't give me an opinion. Like, tell me the facts about what I should consider, right? And so now, put on your AWS hat for a minute, and you're new to AWS, and you have a container-based app.
Good
Yeah, I think
example.
that's like the classic example, right? So, and which one of the, I don't know, what are 17,
17.
16 services, 17 services that'll run a container? On one hand, that's fantastic because each of those are optimized for various things.
Mhm.
They were built for a
For a
reason.
specific use case. Yeah.
We don't just build things to build things. There are specific use cases and specific optimizations. But when you're coming into that world and you don't know the differences, that's
It's overwhelming.
I actually think it's
Mhm.
more challenging than
Mhm.
my my countertop analog. So that was one of the things that really drove, like, recognizing that type of experience coming to AWS and the role that we could play as the documentation team to make that a little easier to navigate. I mean, at the end of the day, nobody wants to spend a lot of time in documentation, and um, I when I see our numbers, our traffic numbers go up or go down, I'm sometimes puzzled on how I should think about it. Because on one hand, if
Yeah,
the
it might
traffic
be.
goes down, maybe that's good, right?
Mhm.
So
People spend
in a
less
perfect
time
world,
on
you
the
don't need
documentation.
docs. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Talking about metrics, we like data at Amazon. What would be, because you mentioned the quality of the documentation or the
Yeah.
time a customer spent on the documentation, what are the metrics that you're monitoring to
Yeah, good
evaluate the
question.
quality of the documentation? Traffic alone is not a good metric for doc.
Yeah, traffic is almost a useless metric
Mhm.
when it comes to this, because there could be a new service launched and we see a spike in
Mhm.
traffic. People learning about that service, that's totally expected. And so one of the things we look at, if you go to any of the documentation pages, there's a thumbs up, thumbs down dialogue, and you can enter some comments
Mhm.
there, and we read those.
That's something I keep telling to all customers. Please leave feedback there because there are real
Yeah,
humans that are reading your
that's
comments
right.
there. They don't believe me.
Yeah,
They say, yeah, it's an automatic thing. No.
yeah. Well, not only that, I mean, if I could share a little bit about how we're
Mhm.
organized, I think it might help our customers understand us a little better. The way we're organized is by service. So a lot of the bigger services, like S3, for example, has multiple tech writers. That's their full-time job, and they work very closely with the engineering team and the product management team. They know the product inside out. Our technical writers are extremely technical. And it's actually one of the things that impressed me the most when I got here is just the absolute passion and technical aptitude of the tech writers was kind of mind blowing to me. And if you think about how hard it is to find someone that has the writing skills and has the technical
Mhm.
chops, that Venn diagram can be challenging, right? And especially when you get into some of the more complicated, niche
And
products. And
dive deep into very specific point. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. Because if you don't understand it, you can't really
Right.
document it in a way that
Mhm.
speaks to a builder developer. And so anyway, we look at the percentage of thumbs up and thumbs down relative to the number of visits. So that gives us somewhat of a ratio of how people are feeling. So that's sort of the thing that appears on the dashboard. But we also pay close attention just to what people are telling us. I mean, we try to speak to a lot of folks. We met with like a year and a half ago, I think. We had a group of AWS heroes that we invited in and said, "Hey, we'd just love for y'all to come spend a day with us, tell you some things we're thinking about doing, get your feedback." And it was incredibly helpful. Like, the the AWS Heroes program is one of my favorite programs because every member of that, they're so legit. Like, they are eyeballs deep in this stuff, and they sometimes know it way better than we do inside of AWS. And also they'll be really honest. with you. At first they were being a little too, hey, your docs are fine. I think they're excellent. But we very quickly got past the, quit trying to make me
The
feel
polite
good. And
aspect of the meeting.
that's right. Yeah. Like, don't tell me what I want to hear. Tell me what I need to hear, and, but then we actually got into some areas where, okay, if I'm using Lambda and I want to connect to Aurora, there's a few ways to do that, right? So what is the best way, and why are there multiple ways? And so more cross-service content is one of the needs we heard.
And
So
that might be a challenge because you said we are organized into teams. So the S3 team is responsible for the
yeah,
S3 documentation. But as soon as we start to talk across multiple services,
yeah,
how do we organize the team to write that?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's kind of interesting, the evolution of the team. Way before I got here, they were organized by service team, which I think is the right thing because you want to be able to pair them up with the engineers and the product folks. Very quickly, we needed to create a team that was sort of outside of the core services team, someone that could focus on creating content around using multiple services together, helping decide which service you even should use, which countertop to buy. Um, and and it was challenging, and quite frankly it felt like boiling the ocean, like it's just too much. And we just decided, let's just start somewhere and work our way through it, and we've actually made some real progress that we're proud of.
And that's a
So
good segue with my next question. What
yeah,
did we change the last 12 months or last year in 2024
yeah, yeah,
in the doc?
yeah, definitely. So a few things. If you go to the Docs homepage, and it's kind of funny how many people never go to the Docs homepage because, most of us, myself included, you're on a search engine like Google or whatever, and
And we
you
enter
Google it,
directly. Yeah.
and you land like 14 levels deep in the Docs. You never look at the homepage, and that's fine. We totally recognize that. And by the way, that means we have to pay attention to things like SEO, et cetera. But we did update the Docs homepage. One, we just wanted to make it look better. I don't want people to think that we're just focused on making really great lipstick on a pig. It's but it matters that how things are organized. So if you don't know where to start, our goal for the homepage was to make it a great starting place. And it's not just for documentation; it actually has pointers out to other resources, other technical resources. So we focused on that and a new product selector, and just kind of used that as a starting point. The second thing that we really made some progress on in 2024 is what we call decision guides. And that gets back to that, which container service should I use? Even taking a simpler example, which database?
Relational
Yeah.
database, graph, key value, in-memory storage.
Yeah, vector
Several
database,
options.
right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, exactly. But even just taking simple relational database, trying to decipher the actual differences between RDS, Aurora, Aurora V2, Aurora V2 serverless. That can be, for those of us that have been inside for a while, we're like, well, it's obvious. But for someone new, no, it's
Not
not.
at all.
They have different pricing models, they have different features, they scale in different ways, and they're optimized for different things. That's the thing I keep hammering, is they're optimized for different things. So one of literally the first guide we built was how to choose a database. And we intentionally, we had some long debates about this. We didn't want to create a documentation page that had a decision tree, because we had a lot of people suggesting, hey, create a decision tree, make the
And so,
customer
do you
click
need
this and
this? Yes. Do you need that? No.
yeah,
And then it will lead us to a
it's just
result.
yeah, yeah. The yellow brick road would take you to the right service. The problem with that is that we learned very quickly is that the permutations become unwieldy. Like it just gets out of hand, and sometimes it's not that simple, right? You can ask a customer, "Are you building this type of app or that type of app?" Often
They
the
don't
answer
know.
is, "Well, neither." Like
Or
I'm
neither.
building something very specific, or something that that encompasses both. And I think most developers, at least the way I've always been, I don't want someone to tell me I should pick X versus Y. I want to understand X and I want to understand Y.
So I can
So
take
then
my
I can decide
decision.
if I'm going to agree or disagree with your recommendation, right? And so I think teaching the reader what are the options, give them all the pertinent and relevant facts, and then let them make the decision. Developers, that's what we do. I mean, developers are perpetual learners and perpetual decision makers, and you don't want to try to shortcut that. And so anyway, so we built that guide. We paid attention to how people were receiving it. We talked to some customers that had seen it for the first time, and it was very well received. And so then we did one for containers, and we did one for non-relational databases. So I think we have like 25 or 26 of those guides
Yeah, that's
available
correct. I
now,
was
and more
just
coming.
looking at it
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
There are 25 of these that are published. If you want to search for that, just type AWS Decision Guides in Google. That's the easiest way to,
Yeah.
to get to it. And
Yeah,
actually, that's a
exactly.
fantastic resource. I just learned about that a few weeks ago, literally, because the news somehow didn't came up to me. And
Yeah.
I start to read these, and yeah, just to name a few, Amazon SQS, Amazon SNS, or even Bridge. It's a question I
Right.
hear all the time.
All the time. Yeah.
Which storage service should I use between S3 or EBS, or EBS versus EFS versus FS6? And,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
there are many others in that guide. So there are 25 guides like that help us to choose a product. WAF or AWS Shield? Good question.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and what we realized is that before those decision guides, the developer, the reader, whoever's visiting the website, they would have to go read about
one or the other, and the other.
And that's what a terrible experience, right? Because there's a lot of documentation. You're like, I don't need all this because I don't even know if it's what I'm going to use. Like, I just want to know, what is it optimized for? What is it good at? What is it not? So we're very proud of those. Now I'll be self-critical of us, and the fact that you didn't know about it, until recently, is one of our challenges, right? I could say, well, Sebastian, how could you not know about it? It's right there on the Docs homepage. Yeah, well, you don't visit the Docs homepage, right? So like that's not even, that's not a thing. But I think further integrating that content to make it more discoverable.
It can even be linked from the service page inside the AWS WAF service page at the very top there, just next with, we can link to a decision page.
Yeah, because your Google's, like, if you're looking for a database, your Google search may lead you to the Aurora user guide, right? But Aurora might not be the best option for what you're building, and it would be great if you had a resource right there on that page that said, hey, there are other options, right? And that's where we're heading very quickly.
There is another change that you drove in 2024, which is the readability of bigger fonts, a bit more space, different color scheme. I think accessibility is one of the key concerns, and the inclusion for people that have difficulties to read or to perceive colors.
Yeah, exactly. We, AWS, we take accessibility very seriously, and quite frankly, we weren't doing a great job documentation. We had a lot of images with no alt text, which makes it super challenging for a developer that's visually impaired, and they're trying to figure it out. I mean, we do strive to not build, to make sure that the documentation can stand alone without the images. Like, you should never be reliant on an image. The image should help you quickly absorb it, right? But if we don't give alt text, that made it challenging. There's proper hierarchy of content to make sure you have your header tags in the right nesting so it's consistent. And by the way, there's another advantage of doing that, right? And that's language models. We fully... Well, I'll hop on my soapbox about AI for a minute, because this is a topic I'm super excited about. We fully recognize that a lot of people that want to learn AWS come to the documentation website. A lot of them, Google search it or whatever, but a lot of them go to, Amazon Q, of course, ChatGPT,
Perplexity,
Claude. Perplexity, all these different, Gemini, etc. All these different language models out there. They look at the documentation as what we call the source code of knowledge about AWS. And so if the content is confusing to a human, it's often confusing to the language model. And I'll give you a great example, a real example. Prior to 2024, the EC2 guide, one of our oldest services, is, and very widely used services, we had a guide for Linux for
Mhm.
EC2, and we had a separate guide for Windows. And when the Windows support first came out, and this predates me, but I've learned the history from some of the folks that have been on the team for a while. Uh, at that time, the best thing to do was to create a separate guide because it was a different type of audience and you didn't want to mix terminology. But what we realized is that oftentimes the various language models, ChatGPT, et cetera, were giving incorrect answers because it was mixing those two things without actually, without having that understanding.
Yeah, they don't understand it's the same subject for two different audiences, so they treat that separately. That's what you mean?
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. And we didn't have, not every page made it clear whether you're in the Windows guide, deeply
Mhm.
nested down in the Windows guide or the Linux guide. So one of the things, and we've done a lot of studying on this as a team, and this is an evolving space. It's not like there's an
A good or bad
encyclopedia on how
answer.
to.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're all figuring this out, and but um, but we made the decision to merge those two guides and basically do a rewrite and to make it very clear in the guide. If you're Windows, here are the commands or here are the options that you have, and if you're Linux, here's the other options. And not only did it make it easier to read and consume by humans, it did the same thing for language models. And by the way, it was like a 40% reduction in overall content
Wow.
around EC2, which that's a win no matter how you look at it, right? So that's huge. And then there's many other examples of where we would have a page for how to modify the configuration of something, and the header at the top of the page would say configuration. It wouldn't say RDS configuration.
Mhm.
And you
Mhm.
could look at the breadcrumbs and tell that you were, the
Inside
navigation of the,
RDS. Yeah.
you could tell you were in RDS, but it's not that obvious. So it's just a lot of basics like that. And so that all made it more accessible, and it also made it more consumable by LLMs and RAG, et cetera. And we're continuing to find other ways.
It's interesting that what makes a page accessible for humans also makes it accessible for crawlers
Yeah,
and
yeah,
search engine
exactly.
and large language model later. So decision guides, the revamp of the homepage, the accessibility. Anything else before we move to the roadmap and what's coming next?
Yeah, we've done a few things. One feature that we added that has been surprisingly popular, like more popular than I expected, was focus mode.
Oh yes,
It,
the menu that disappear on the left. Yeah.
yeah, because
Mhm.
when you come to our site, there's all the chapters on the left, like you're in a
Mhm.
guide, like you're deep down in the Lambda guide, and on the left are all the other sections of Lambda, and on the right is navigation to other things on the page, and across the top's all this other stuff. And it all those things are useful, but when you're in learning mode and you just want to read, that all becomes distractions. And so we just added a very simple feature called focus mode. And so you'll see this new little checkbox at the top, or a switch at the top to put it in focus mode. And a lot of that goes away and you're just in that plain view. Um, by the way,
Inspired by the browser on macOS, Safari has that focus mode since a couple of years. You can do that on
exactly.
any web page.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
exactly. Well, here's what's funny. We found out, I talked to someone recently that had a Chrome extension that would do exactly what focus mode did for AWS Docs. Custom Chrome extension. And I said, well, you can throw that away. And he was super excited that we had the feature. So yeah, that and
Before jumping on the
yeah,
2025 roadmap and beyond, I have one more
yeah,
question. The doc from AWS is the absolute source of truth. I'm working a lot with solution architect, technical account manager.
yeah,
If we can find something in the doc, we send it to the customer. That's I was about to take a religious analogy, like the Bible, the master of the master. If it is there,
yeah.
it's the truth. How can you ensure, or maybe you don't, it's the service team, you will tell me, the correctness of everything
Yeah.
that's there.
Yeah, that is a huge challenge. Because, it's not just adding new features, it's when sometimes features are deprecated and we have to make sure we represent that. Sometimes features are available in particular regions, but not in other regions, and that needs to be clearly documented. So there's all these dimensions to it that makes it challenging. But to your point, it's really one of our top, I think our first tenet is, is the source of truth. And we keep it up to date and we strive to do that. We often look at the documentation, because we have dedicated teams for each section. They do their best to keep it up to date. Another thing that we're hoping is going to help, and we're starting to do some early experiments, and this is another opportunity for AI to help us out.
Mm-hmm.
Because AI can do a pretty good job. You can give it two different documents and tell it to look for conflicts between the two. It does a surprisingly good job of that today. And so in there lies an opportunity for us, right? So,
while you were talking, I was thinking, I don't remember having found a factual error in the doc. Sometimes
well, that's good.
it might be a bit more precise, or there is some part missing, like they should explain that too. But really being factually incorrect, I don't remember it happens. Of course, I've biased view or limited view on the doc.
Yeah, because there's a listener right now that's saying,
that's not true. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're going to reach out to us.
But that's a big part of the earned trust as well. One of our leadership principles, saying we should earn the trust. We must earn the 100%. Trust of our developers, and by providing correct and relevant information in time. So we talk about what your team works the last year. What are you working on for next year? I know we typically don't disclose our roadmaps, but I know you have some big plans for the docs as well.
I can definitely give you some signal on what we're thinking. One of the things that we recently launched that we're going to continue to push forward on in this year is this recommended content. So when you're looking at a specific guide, there are recommendations on the right of like what is the most likely next thing you need to go look at. And we've been doing a lot of experimenting with using AI to do that for you. And it's working really well. Like we're having some success. So I think in 2025, we're going to try to create these really well-lit paths through the content with the help of AI. Eventually, now this is just Greg dreaming, but eventually we want it to be smart enough that if you're on a particular user guide and I'm on a particular user guide, for you is different than me because we have different backgrounds, different services that we're using, different patterns of how we've accessed documentation. And so we're looking at how we can make it smarter based on that. So I give you a little bit of hint of what we're playing around with.
Can we imagine something linked to the builder ID profile or to the AWS account? If we are authenticated on AWS, the service
I think
we
that's
are
a prerequisite.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's a prerequisite because it needs to know more about me in order to give really good recommendations. It needs to know more about you. And I think builder ID is the key to that. So yeah, absolutely. On the AI side, I'd love to talk about the authoring and how we're thinking about AI.
That was one of the questions I have. Are there page generated by AI now on the doc?
Yeah, it's complicated, right? And we've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and we've already made some progress, and we have more coming. So here's how I think about AI when it comes to authoring content. AI is not great at documenting things it has no knowledge of. So if I'm going to launch a new service tomorrow, I can't just go to one of these language models and say, create documentation for, Amazon XYZ. And it's like, I don't know what that is. And so when it comes to new content, I think we still have a high reliance on humans to understand and create that. And we've even started half jokingly calling it the source code of content is the documentation, because from there, the language models have it. And then that helps derive other content. And I'll get to that in a minute. There are things we can do with AI when creating new content, though, making sure that we have a consistent style, consistent tone, make sure that, we're, like I mentioned earlier, we're doing experiments on dynamically knowing whether it conflicts with something else. Um, yeah, that there could be some new database feature come out. And as a result of that new feature, the decision guide around databases is now in need of an update. Right. And so right now we have to just kind of mentally track all that. We don't have the right dependency metadata in place. And so we're going to be, focused on that. And I think AI will help with that. Now, there's a different type of content, and it's what I call derivative content. And you can go to any language model today and say, my canonical example is how to create a static website on AWS.
Mm-hmm. So like a tutorial.
And yeah, and you can go to any of the, go to your favorite language model and say, create a step-by-step guide for deploying a static website on AWS, and you'll get a pretty decent guide. And I call that derivative content. I could task a writer with going and writing that guide and implementing the best practices. We often start authoring a decision guide with a conversation with a language model. So we have various prompts and things.
Yeah, you present AI right now as a tool to help the author either to get started or to correct or to detect conflicts with another page of the doc.
Right.
But you don't see them directly as an author themselves.
No, exactly. So for example, when we did the database decision guide, the author that, and he actually shared the transcript with me. He went to a couple of different language models and said, create a table of all of the AWS relational database services, illustrating the differences in what each is optimized for. I don't know, whatever it is, this elaborate prompt. And it came back. And if you just glanced at it, you were like, that's perfect, publish, but it wasn't perfect. And we looked at it and said, oh, well, this is wrong, that's wrong. It had a lot of inaccuracies in it. But here's where there's an opportunity to create a virtuous cycle. If we use AI to do first draft, and then that first draft, the technical writer or any technical expert looks at it and corrects it, and then they publish it, you've actually, that will get reabsorbed by the language models, right? They get reconsumed.
The next generation, yeah.
Exactly. And so you're creating this virtual cycle of improvement with this human in the loop. And so I think for derivative type of content, we get a lot of acceleration. Like we created those 25 guides pretty quickly. I would say probably twice as fast as if we didn't have AI. Yeah, it was substantial, and it's exciting. And again, the side benefit is every one of those required edits and corrections, and we put it out there, and then you wait a few months and you ask the same question again, you actually get a lot better results. I can't prove that it's because we did it, because there's not a lot of telemetry around that these days. But we're pretty confident that played a role. So yeah, we're looking at lots of ways to leverage the technology, but also recognizing that when it comes to creating content for new things, it's kind of human first, and then the language models take it from there.
How the developers that are listening to us can contribute to the doc. I remember at some point there were some experiment to have GitHub in the loop, and people can send pull requests. I think that's something that we drop. So what? Sorry, there are two parts of my question. Maybe one of why we dropped that. Maybe it looks like a good idea, and then how can we contribute? Can we bring feedback?
Yeah, so I'm happy to talk about that, because that was a decision I made fairly early when I came in. So here's the story behind that. Before I got here, the decision was made to put all of the documentation on GitHub so we could get pull requests, and the intent was absolutely what it should be. Like, we want to engage with our customers. Sometimes they know better than we do about certain services because they've used it in the real world. And but what we realized, there were two things. One, there were not a lot of pull requests, and there were a lot of customers that thought, "Hey, it's not my job to keep your documentation accurate," and that's fair, right?
That's okay. We are a multi-billion-dollar company. We should not ask for volunteers to maintain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the other thing was, just to be really self-critical, is that we realized we were not doing a good job of responding to the pull request and issues. And,
It
you
was
know,
not integrated into the publication
it
system.
it wasn't. I mean, the dirty truth is, and we shared this when we put out a blog
Mhm,
post about it, but it was a shadow copy. It
mhm,
wasn't actually integrated into the authoring tooling. The authoring tooling was born many years ago when there were 20 services and 22 tech writers, and it's evolved and evolved, and one of the things we're starting in 25, and I'm not going to say too much about it, but we are revamping the entire authoring experience to make it very um, uh, more extendable, and more AI features built in to really make it an efficient experience. And I think that'll open some doors for us. But anyway, getting back to GitHub,
mhm.
um, if you put something uh, on GitHub, there is an expectation that you're going to take care of pull requests in a timely manner. And there was also the impression by most customers is that they were doing pull requests against the master copy of docs, and they weren't. And so it literally relied on the writer to go look at GitHub, see the pull request, make a decision, go back to the master copy, make whatever
Mhm.
changes they needed, and then publish, and then close the loop. And we looked at it, I was like, it just simply wasn't happening. And there was, yeah, I think Corey Quinn is someone probably a lot of your listeners is familiar with.
Mhm.
He's very, very entertaining.
He
And
was on the podcast in December.
oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, I missed. Okay, I have to go back and look at that. All right. I hope Corey's listening because he'll appreciate this. He tweeted something that I think this was right around the time I arrived at AWS, and he said, if I need a place to store my biggest secrets, I'll store them in an AWS Docs pull request. And that cut me deep, man. And so we got together as a team, and we said, this is one of those things that if you can't do it right, you shouldn't do it at all. You're doing more harm by making it look like you're doing it right. And so we made the tough decision to say, we're not ready for this. It would require us really pouring a lot of resources into doing it right. And I would rather, and this was the big part of the decision, I would rather make the docs better than make the GitHub experience better.
Mhm.
We definitely want to get back to where there is a contribution model, and whether it's through GitHub or some other mechanism, we would definitely want to get back to that. I can't make any commitments on when that'll happen, but right now our focus is better. So, but sometimes you need to make tough decisions like that. And we were worried how people would react. There were a few people that were upset, but most people were like, "Hey, it's good to see that they're acknowledging that they are not doing a great job, and they take it seriously, and they're going to focus on the content." And hopefully, by all the things that we've done in the last year, you can see we actually did take those resources,
Mhm. Back
focus on making it better.
to improving
Yeah,
the documentation. And so the second part of my question, but we addressed that a bit earlier, just to repeat, if developer wants to leave feedback, they use the feedback mechanism on
that's right.
the doc page, the little thumbs up and down, and the comment,
Yeah,
because there are real
yes,
people in your team and the service team reading these
that's right.
comments.
Yeah, we definitely do. We also look for trends, like we'll see suddenly the percentage of people clicking thumbs down increases. And it always correlates with some new announcement that was made or some new feature that was added. And
Mhm.
so why are people struggling with it? Um, we also recognize that a lot of times that thumbs up, thumbs down is a proxy for how they
Mhm.
feel about the service itself.
So it's
And
not the doc they are providing feedback for; it's,
yeah,
it's the service.
well, I mean, not to air too much dirty laundry, but one of the worst feedback uh, that gets the most thumbs down is the help for the login page. But the docs, the help for the login page, there's not a lot to say, right? And if someone is struggling to log in, they're already pretty upset. And then they go to the docs and there's not a clear, here's what's wrong.
And so they
Now
are
they're
even
mad at the
more
docs,
upset.
right? And they're going to take it out, so. But that's completely fair. I would be the exact same way. And so we're trying to recognize that your perception of docs is also influenced by other things. It's your overall perception of AWS and the experience you're having with it that day, and the role we can play.
That's a fascinating discussion about the doc at AWS. Um,
Yeah.
I have one last question to conclude this conversation. You have many years of experience together with dozens of years of industry experience. What is the most unique thing you can think about the doc at AWS?
Just the sheer scale and complexity. The number of services we support, the number of regions that we support it in, and trying to just track all of that. You think about something like reInvent, where there's a lot of announcements being made, and these were things I had to learn coming in. I did not have an appreciation for the behind the scenes with docs, but there are a lot of people coordinating that when that new feature is announced at 9 a.m. on stage at reInvent, documentation has to be available at that exact moment. And if you don't have the docs out there, what a terrible experience that is for the customer. I just learned about this new thing, and most developer types like us, like, I don't want to read the marketing. I want to read. Show me the docs. What does it do? Show me some code.
Yeah, it's an extremely coordinated ballet, I would say, with the console team that needs to open the fruit to the new part of the console, the doc team. I'm part of the blog team. Typically, there is the news blog as well going on, and all of that needs to be synchronized with while the keynote is happening on stage, and now we announce that, and now we announce that, and now we announce that. And
that's right. Yeah. Yeah. So that just how incredible the team is at managing all of that and coordinating all of that was just inspiring to me. I just thought it was pretty amazing.
Do you have an idea of the amount of doc that we have, if we have to translate that to books or page or something tangible for our listeners? It's huge.
I've looked at that, actually. It's a little complicated because like a lot of the API documentation is auto-generated. But when it comes to like human created content, I think one time it's like 40,000 pages of single spaced, and so that's like, for those of you old enough to remember the Encyclopedia Britannica, it's about that size, and it's a lot. Now, I'm going to get ahead of some of your listeners. There are some listeners right now thinking, yeah, Greg, that's the problem. There's too much. And we hear you, and we're looking at that too. Like, what is the most efficient way sometimes to document is an important question. Another thing, if you can give me just a minute, I just want to recognize that I think a lot of people with the rapid evolution of AI models, they're learning differently now. Like, back in my early days before the internet, yes, I'm that old, and I learned from books. I learned. By the way, you had one of your guests was a Commodore 64 guy, and I listened to that whole episode because I was not a rich kid. Or at least not that rich. I had a Commodore VIC-20, which was like the lower end version of it.
Of the Commodore.
But, I did assembly on that thing. I think I was one of I can't imagine what the person at the computer store thought when I ordered the assembly language cartridge for my VIC-20. Probably the only one they ever sold. But anyway, you would read the book, you would read it cover to cover, right? And your guest said that about, the Commodore or the Commodore 64. But then as the internet comes up, now we Googled shortcut to the right page of the docs and absorbed that way. But now I think the way people learn is changing. And I'll give you a great example. Recently, one of my side hobbies is photography, and I've done photography most of my life. I used to do it professionally for a while, and I enjoy it. It's one of my ways to relax. And I have the latest Nikon Z8 camera. I love it. That thing is a monster camera.
Did you read the doc?
Well, I'm getting to that. So, yeah, well, I did for the camera, but one of the things about the camera though is that it has incredible video features. Like, it'll do 4K, 120 frames a second, and I don't know why you'd want to do that, but it, do HDR video, and I thought I want to learn how to do video. I'd never done anything with video, and one of the keys to doing any type of videos is editing. So I wanted to learn Final Cut Pro. And now I could have read the documentation to Final Cut Pro. But what I did, and by the way, I wasn't trying to make a point. I wasn't even in work mode. What I did is I found a couple of YouTube influencers that were really experts, and they had some really good YouTube videos. But every time it would leave me confused. Like, I don't understand the difference between this codec and that codec, or this type of HDR versus that color space. And what I would do is I would open up ChatGPT or Claude, and I actually went back and forth. And I would say, tell me the difference between this and that. Well, how does that relate to this other thing? And I had this long conversation, multiple pages. And in a weekend, I became very proficient at editing video. And then I had this aha moment on Monday morning, getting back to work, that I just learned a really complicated thing. And I never once looked at the documentation. But I guarantee you that most of the answers I was getting from those language models was derived from the documentation, the source code of knowledge, and but that was an aha moment. And I shared that with my entire team, that I learned how to edit videos. And I think that changes the expectations of what documentation is. I think a lot of people, especially younger people just coming out of school right now, are learning how to use all these different services and learning how to write really complicated applications because they have AI helping them out. And they may never go to docs.aws.amazon.com. And that's okay. We have to be okay with that.
I have similar stories. I mentor a junior developer for a conference the other day. And she was using a library that I wrote, and I spent a lot of time writing the README. It's small documentation. It has nothing to do with what you're doing. But she was not even reading that or quickly scanning through it, looking at the code example sections, and not even reading the warning below, saying, you have to pay attention to that. And that's so frustrating. As a notor for documentation, it's so frustrating. Back to your point, we can chat with the AWS documentation, can we? There is Amazon Q there. There is the little Q icon.
Yeah, there's Amazon Q, and it's getting better and better. One thing, just to do a quick plug for Q, when it was first announced, a lot of people tried it, and most of us developer types, we make quick decisions about things and move on. But like the rest of the world of AI, it is improving dramatically. And so try it again, because if you had a mixed experience before, keep
like
trying, because
Oh
yeah, I mean, a year ago in AI is 10 years ago, right? I mean, like, come on. And so yeah, and we see that's another thing we'll be focusing on 2025, is how do we integrate that experience even more without having to set up a bunch of things. It should just be inherent in the site. And the other thing about learning, and you hit on it in the comment you made about the library you wrote, we also know a lot of people don't want to read the words, they want to read the code. And if I'm learning about and I'm the same way, if I'm learning about a new API, I don't want to read the 3 paragraphs. I scroll down
to see the code,
and I say, okay, I got it. That's all I need to know. I call it, it's got 4 parameters, whatever. And we're also trying to think differently about how we approach it. We doubled the number of code samples in 2024, which we're very proud of. But at the same time, there need to be a lot more. And we don't have near the coverage we want to have. So I want to brag that we doubled the sample, but I also want to be really humble and say that gets us about a tenth of where we need to be. Right, exactly.
Doubling is doable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, one of my colleagues did a lot of effort for Bedrock and writing a lot of Python code, but not only Python, because AI is not only Python, but also he took pride of providing JavaScript, Java, Go, and Rust code for Bedrock. And that's important. It's difficult to find, but that's another something that we talk about.
We've been experimenting with how can AI help us with that, because sometimes you could have a code sample in Python and you can give it to one of the various language models and say,
generate another,
generate a Rust version of this. And but the trap you'll fall into is it may generate Rust code that runs, but it may not be idiomatic Rust code. A Rust developer might look at it and say, I don't know what you're doing, and so that's where it's really important that we keep the human in the loop to make sure that we're doing a good job on that. And also those code samples, by the way, become additional training material for these language models. Improving derivative content is sort of our mission at AWS, is to make learning AWS easier, which means I want ChatGPT to give the best answers it can give the best answers. And of course, Amazon Q. But we feel responsibility to all of those.
Greg Wilson, you're director of the documentation, the AWS documentation, but not only, also the CLI and the SDK. Maybe I should invite you again because I have tons of questions that might be interesting for developers talking about how we generate the SDK at AWS.
That's a whole other universe, my friend.
That will be another podcast episode. Thank you for the past, the present, and the future of the AWS documentation. Yeah. Thank you for having listened to this episode until the end. Next episode will be next Friday in all your good podcast application. But now, go build and read the documentation.